My name is Captain Elaine Winters, and in just 24 hours, my life was turned upside down. My Aunt Vivian, the only person I considered family, passed away and left me her entire $7 million estate. But before the grief could even settle, my past came back to haunt me. My parents, the people who abandoned me 27 years ago, suddenly reappeared. They weren't here to comfort me. They were here to collect. As your legal guardians, my mother announced with a saccharine smile, we'll be managing things on your behalf. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable, grieving niece. But then the office door opened, and when they saw the Army colonel turned lawyer my aunt had arranged, their smiles vanished. Before I reveal the secret weapon my aunt left in his briefcase, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit like if you believe family is forged in loyalty, not blood. And subscribe to join me on Operation Reclaim My Honor. The air in Colonel Thompson's office was thick with the scent of old mahogany and worn leather, a smell of history and quiet dignity unique to Charleston's historic district. It was the scent of my Aunt Vivian's world, a world of honor and substance. That scent was now being suffocated by the cheap, cloying perfume my mother, Brenda, wore like armor. I sat perfectly still in the wingback chair, my spine straight, my hands clasped in my lap. My dress uniform felt like a second skin, its disciplined structure the only thing holding my grief together. Across the heavy desk, Colonel Thompson, a man whose posture seemed carved from granite, cleared his throat. His voice was deep and steady, a voice accustomed to command, not condolences. He began to read from the last will and testament of Vivian Hughes. My heart ached with every mention of her name. I focused on the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a rhythmic beat marking the final moments of a life I cherished. The colonel's voice moved through the legal jargon until it reached the primary bequest. And so, to the singular source of my pride and the light of my life, my beloved niece, Captain Elaine Winters, I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all properties, assets, and controlling interest in Hughes Logistics. A sharp intake of breath cut through the solemn air. Excuse me, Colonel. My mother's voice sliced through the room, syrupy sweet but laced with steel. I'm sure there's been some mistake. Colonel Thompson paused, his eyes lifting from the document, his expression unreadable. Brenda gave him a practiced, apologetic smile. We are her blood relatives, after all. Her next of kin. She then gestured towards me with a flick of her wrist, a dismissive, almost pitiful gesture. Elaine is just the niece. She emphasized the word just with a subtle, venomous pressure, as if 27 years of my aunt's unwavering love and devotion were nothing more than a footnote, easily erased by a drop of their irresponsible blood. It was the first shot fired. A calculated attempt to invalidate my legal and emotional existence from the outset. I didn't flinch. I simply cataloged the attack, assessing the threat. The colonel, unfazed, continued reading. The will had a special addendum, a passage Vivian must have written herself. His voice softened slightly as he read her words. And to my Elaine, I leave my most precious possession, my entire library. It is a legacy of wisdom and strength, the true source of our family's power. May the stories of those who came before guide you. A harsh, grating sound erupted from my father's side of the room. Richard let out a bark of a laugh. Books? He boomed, his voice too loud for the dignified space. He looked around as if seeking an audience. The girl's running an empire now. She needs cash, not scrap paper. Just sell the lot of them. The words struck me harder than Brenda's insult. This was more than just crass ignorance. It was a desecration. A deliberate act of spitting on the grave of a woman who taught me that knowledge was armor and integrity was a weapon. To him, anything that couldn't be converted into a dollar figure was worthless, including love, including wisdom. He wasn't just dismissing a collection of books, he was dismissing the very soul of the woman who had saved me. Colonel Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He calmly turned a page and pointed a finger at a specific clause. The will is ironclad, Mr. and Mrs. Winters. It was structured to be unassailable. The sickly sweet smile finally melted from my mother's face, replaced by a cold, reptilian glare. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss meant only for me. "You don't want to go to war with us, Elaine," she whispered, the words slithering through her gritted teeth. "The courts always side with the parents. They'll see you as an unstable soldier, overwhelmed by grief. We'll have you declared incompetent. You'll lose everything, sweetie." It was a classic psychological warfare tactic: sow fear, attack a perceived weakness, and hope for a surrender before the first real battle. She was counting on me being the broken little girl they had abandoned all those years ago. She didn't know that the military doesn't just train you to march. It trains you to stand your ground. It trains you to face down threats far more significant than a bitter woman in a stale perfume. My silence seemed to embolden my father. Richard stood up, his face reddening. "Now you listen here, Colonel. We're not just going to sit back and let this happen." That's when I moved. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply placed my hand flat on the polished mahogany of the table. The soft thud was enough to silence him. "Father, mother." My voice was cold and even, stripped of all emotion. It was the voice of a captain addressing insubordinate troops. "You are in the office of a United States Army colonel. I suggest you show some respect." Their mouths snapped shut. I then turned my full attention to the man at the head of the table, and for the first time since entering the room, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. It didn't reach my eyes. This wasn't about warmth. It was about alliance. "It's a pleasure to officially meet you, Colonel Thompson," I said, my tone formal and clear. "I believe Aunt Vivian left you with some operational directives?" The shift in the room was palpable. My parents' faces went from smug entitlement to raw confusion. The colonel's stoic expression gave way to a flicker of something that looked like respect, maybe even pride. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The battle lines were drawn. The two-front war my aunt had prepared me for had just begun. But as I looked at the bewildered faces of the people who gave me life only to cast me aside, I knew I couldn't fight effectively without understanding the enemy's history. To plan a campaign, I first needed intelligence. I needed to go back to the very first day of the war. The day it all began. To understand the enemy standing before me now, I had to retreat into the memory of the 8-year-old girl they left behind. The human mind is a strange fortress. It buries the deepest wounds under layers of time and training, but the scars remain. Mine was etched on a rainy Charleston night 27 years ago. I remember the feeling of the cold, damp concrete porch beneath my thin socks. A relentless southern drizzle was falling, blurring the edges of the world into a hazy, unforgiving gray. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and jasmine, a scent that, to this day, makes my stomach clench. My father placed my small suitcase on the steps. It was a cheap, cardboard thing, holding a few changes of clothes and a worn teddy bear named Sergeant Patches. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on some distant point over my head. "Be good, Elaine," he'd mumbled, his voice rough and hurried. Then he turned and walked back to the car, his shoulders hunched against the rain. My mother never even got out. I could see her silhouette through the fogged-up passenger window, a motionless shadow in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She didn't wave. She didn't look back. There was no tearful goodbye, no final hug. I was a transaction being completed, a package being delivered. I didn't cry. A part of me, even then, understood that crying was a weakness I couldn't afford. So I just stood there, a small solitary figure on the porch of a house I didn't know, and listened. I listened to the sound of their car's engine turning over, a tired, sputtering cough. I listened as it faded down the long, oak-lined driveway, its red taillights shrinking until they were swallowed by the mist. When the sound was gone completely, a profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the tin roof above me. And in that silence, a single, devastating question bloomed in my chest. Why? That feeling, the cold, hard certainty of being something that could simply be left behind, became a permanent part of my internal architecture. It was the scar tissue around which the rest of my life would be built. The heavy front door swung inward. My Aunt Vivian stood there, framed by the warm, golden light of the hallway. She was a tall, formidable woman, wrapped in a silk dressing gown the color of midnight. She didn't rush to me, didn't scoop me into a comforting embrace. She didn't offer platitudes or pity. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes, her own gaze clear and steady, and said the words that would become the foundation of my new life. In this house, we do not cry on the porch, Elaine. We come inside, we make a plan, and we fight. She gave me not what I wanted, but what I needed. She didn't give me sympathy, she gave me a mission. That night, she didn't read me fairy tales about princesses waiting to be rescued. She sat me down at the great oak table in her study, spread out a topographical map of the Appalachian Trail, and taught me how to read contour lines. She gave me a complex algebra problem and waited patiently while I worked through it. She wasn't building a wall to shield me from the world. She was handing me the tools to build my own weapons. She was teaching me to navigate, to calculate, to survive. A few years later, my parents called. It was the first and only time. I was 11, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. They remembered me. They want me back. I crept to the door of Vivian's study, my ear pressed against the cool wood. But they weren't asking for me. I heard my aunt's voice, colder and harder than I'd ever heard it before. "No, Richard, I will not pay off another one of your gambling debts from Vegas," she said, her tone like ice. "The girl has a future here. A real one. Do not try to ruin it." There was a pause, and then the sharp, definitive click of the receiver being placed back in its cradle. In that moment, the last vestiges of childhood hope shattered. I understood the painful, ugly truth. To them, I wasn't a daughter they missed. I was a key. A potential access point to my aunt's money. My existence was conditional, my value measured only by what could be extracted through me. The pain was sharp, but it was also clarifying. It was the moment I stopped waiting for them to come back. On my 13th birthday, Aunt Vivian gave me a thick, leather-bound book on the great military leaders of history. Tucked inside, she had underlined a quote from General George S. Patton in bold red ink. "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." That quote became my creed. It became the lens through which I viewed everything. The abandonment was no longer a shameful wound to be hidden. It was my first challenge. My enlistment in the army wasn't an escape, it was an acceptance of the next challenge. Facing down threats in hostile territory, leading my soldiers, pushing my body and mind to their absolute limits. It was all just a way of chasing that exhilaration, of proving that the girl left on the porch could not be broken. Aunt Vivian didn't just save me from a life of neglect. She saw the core of steel that had been forged in that cold, lonely moment on her porch, and she spent the next decade tempering it. Long before I ever put on my first uniform, she had already made me a soldier. She had given me the map of my own wounds and taught me how to read it, not as a history of pain, but as a blueprint for strength. And now, facing the enemy she always knew would return, it was time to put that training to use. A core tenet of military intelligence is to never assume, always verify. Emotions are liabilities in the field. Assumptions are fatal. After reliving the raw pain of my past, I needed to switch gears from emotional recollection to tactical action. My brief phone call with Colonel Thompson had confirmed it. The best defense is a proactive offense. To win this war, I couldn't wait for them to make a move. I had to draw them out onto my chosen battlefield. I made the call the next morning. My voice was calm, measured, betraying none of the turmoil from the night before. I invited them to dinner at Hall's Chop House, an upscale Charleston institution known for its dry-aged steaks and exorbitant wine list. It was a place I knew they couldn't resist, a stage perfectly set for their performance. "I think we should talk," I said simply, offering a verbal olive branch that I knew they would see as a white flag. "Oh, Elaine, honey, of course, we'd love that," Brenda's voice chirped with manufactured delight. The hook was set, the fish were on the line. This wasn't a family dinner, this was a reconnaissance mission on neutral ground. My objectives were clear. 1. Determine their specific demands. 2. Assess their level of commitment to this fight. And 3. Identify any potential weaknesses in their narrative. My intelligence gathering operation was officially underway. We were seated at a corner booth, the dark wood and plush leather creating an illusion of intimacy. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the air. My father, Richard, immediately ordered a bottle of the most expensive Cabernet Sauvignon on the menu without looking at the price, while my mother surveyed the room with the air of a woman who believed she belonged there. As the waiter brought our appetizers, a classic shrimp and grits for me, a reminder of the authentic South my aunt loved, Brenda launched her propaganda campaign. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cool, her touch practiced, and devoid of any genuine warmth. "You know, Elaine," she began, her voice dripping with counterfeit sincerity, "leaving you with Vivian, it was the hardest decision of our lives." I kept my expression neutral, my gaze steady. I was observing, not participating. "We knew we couldn't give you the best," she continued, her eyes misting over on command. "We were young, struggling. So we sacrificed our own happiness for your future. We gave up our only child so that you could have everything." It was a masterful performance, a complete inversion of reality. The gross negligence of abandonment was being repainted as a noble act of martyrdom. Richard, pausing from his wine, nodded gravely in agreement, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. They weren't just telling a lie, they were constructing an alternate history, attempting to brainwash their own daughter into believing she owed them an unpayable debt. They were casting themselves as the victims and me as the ungrateful beneficiary of their great sacrifice. A cold, hard knot of disgust tightened in my stomach. After the main course of prime ribeye steaks had been cleared and my father was on his third glass of wine, he decided it was time to move from emotional manipulation to the real objective. He leaned back in the booth, patting his full stomach with a proprietary air. "Now that you've got everything, Elaine," he said, his tone shifting from sentimental to transactional, "we think it's only fair that you help your parents out a little. We have this investment opportunity in Vegas. A sure thing, really. We just need a little seed money to get it off the ground. $150,000 should do it." $150,000. The number rolled off his tongue so smoothly, so effortlessly, it was clear it had been rehearsed. There was no hesitation, no shame, just the cold, hard demand of a creditor calling in a marker. So that was the price tag they'd put on their parental love. All the talk of sacrifice and difficult decisions was just the preamble to an extortion plot. The appetizer before the shakedown. I suddenly felt the oppressive weight of the fancy meal, the rich food turning to ash in my mouth. I maintained my composure, my military training kicking in, allowing me to compartmentalize the visceral revulsion I felt. I met my father's expectant gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. "That's a significant amount of money," I said, my voice steady. "I'll need some time to consider it." It was the perfect non-committal response, just enough to keep them hopeful, to make them believe their strategy was working. But throughout the entire dinner, my phone had been sitting on the table beside my water glass, screen down. It wasn't just a breach of etiquette I was allowing myself for the evening. It was a listening device. The little red recording icon had been silently capturing every honey-coated lie, every rewritten memory, and every single digit of their audacious demand. When the check came, I paid for it without comment. They left the restaurant believing they had successfully planted the seed of obligation in my mind, confident that their payday was just a matter of time. They had no idea they had just willingly walked into a debriefing and handed me my first piece of actionable intelligence. As soon as I was back in my car, the doors locked, the facade of calm finally crumbled. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the controlled discipline of the evening giving way to a wave of cold fury. I saved the audio file, my fingers moving with swift precision. Then I attached it to a secure message addressed to Colonel Thompson. The subject line was 3 words. The body of the message was 5. Subject: targets engaged. Message: intel acquired. Awaiting further orders. Walking into Colonel Thompson's office was like stepping out of the chaotic battlefield of my emotions and into a secure command center. This wasn't the typical lawyer's den of mahogany and self-important diplomas. This was a soldier's sanctuary. On one wall hung the flag of the United States Army, impeccably folded into its ceremonial triangle and encased in glass. Beside it, a framed black and white photograph showed a much younger Thompson, covered in dust and grit, standing with his unit somewhere that looked hot and dangerous. Battle maps of places I recognized, Fallujah, Kandahar, were pinned to a corkboard. The air smelled of brewed coffee and old paper, a scent of purpose and order. He was standing by the window, looking out over the Charleston rooftops when I entered. He turned, and his greeting wasn't the soft, comforting murmur of a civilian lawyer. It was the direct, no-nonsense acknowledgement of a commanding officer. "Report, Captain." The words were a balm to my frayed nerves. He wasn't treating me like a grieving heiress or a fragile victim. He was treating me like a peer, an officer. I stood straight, my shoulders back, and delivered my report. I recounted the events of the dinner with clinical precision, sticking to facts, observations, and direct quotes. I detailed their tactics, their narrative, their ultimate demand. There was no emotion in my voice, only the flat, analytical tone of an after-action report. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving mine, nodding at key points of intelligence. When I finished, I took out my phone, placed it on his desk, and played the recording from the dinner. Brenda's saccharine lies and Richard's boorish demand for $150,000 filled the quiet office, a profane stain on the honorable atmosphere. When the recording ended, the colonel simply leaned back in his chair, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good," he said. It was the highest form of praise from a man like him. "Excellent work, Captain." In his world, this wasn't a family tragedy to be mourned. It was an intelligence operation, and I had just returned from the field with crucial, undeniable proof. He let out a long, slow breath. "Vivian knew they'd be back," he said, his voice dropping into a deeper, more somber register. "She predicted this exact scenario years ago." He gestured to a worn leather chair opposite his desk. "She wasn't just building a business empire, Captain. She was building a fortress to protect you." For the next hour, he told me about his friendship with my aunt. They had met at a veterans fundraiser and bonded instantly over a shared sense of duty and a mutual disdain for nonsense. He explained how, over the years, as her business grew, her primary concern was never the bottom line. It was always about fortifying her legacy for me. They had spent countless hours in this very office, wargaming every possible scenario, drafting legal contingencies, creating trusts and clauses so airtight that no court on earth could breach them. A wave of understanding washed over me, so powerful it almost took my breath away. All those years, I had interpreted my aunt's strictness as a form of emotional distance. The lessons in finance, the insistence on self-reliance, the constant push to be stronger, smarter, tougher. It wasn't detachment, it was preparation. She hadn't just been raising me, she had been training me, arming me for the most important battle of my life. She was my first commanding officer. "Why?" I finally asked, the question barely a whisper. "Why are you doing all of this? Your obligation to her ended when she died." Colonel Thompson looked at me then, and his eyes were not the eyes of a lawyer looking at a client. They were the eyes of one soldier looking at another, a look of shared understanding that transcends rank and age. In the Army, we have a creed, Winters. The soldier's creed. One line in it is sacred. "I will never leave a fallen comrade," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of that oath. Vivian was my comrade. She fought her battles with honor. She trusted me to have her back. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with mine. "And now, you are my mission." Those words, spoken in the language of my world, by a man who shared my code, broke through the armor I'd spent a lifetime building. 1,000 hollow condolences couldn't have offered a fraction of the comfort that simple declaration gave me. For the first time since Vivian's flag-draped casket had been lowered into the ground, I didn't feel alone. I had backup. I had a unit. As I prepared to leave, a newfound sense of resolve settling in my bones, he stopped me. "One more thing." He walked over to a heavy safe tucked behind a bookshelf and returned with a small, old-fashioned key made of brass. It was heavy and ornate, the kind of key that belonged to a different era. Vivian instructed me to give this to you when you were ready, he said, placing it in my palm. She said you'd know the time. It opens a safe deposit box at the First Citizens Bank downtown. He looked at me, a glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. She called it her intel file on the enemy. She trusted that you, with your skills as an intelligence officer, would know exactly what to do with its contents. The key felt cold and heavy in my hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was an order from a commander I thought I had lost. It was the weapon she had left behind for me in the armory. My heart beat a steady, determined rhythm. My next objective was clear. After my meeting with Colonel Thompson, a quiet, strategic resolve had settled over me. I held the key to my aunt's armory, a tangible piece of her foresight. But I adhered to the colonel's advice: hold your position, maintain discipline, and wait for the enemy to reveal their next vector of attack. I didn't have to wait long. Having failed in their frontal assault, my parents shifted to a more insidious form of warfare, a psychological campaign designed to isolate and discredit me. The first volley was fired from the most sacred ground imaginable. It was after the Sunday service at St. Michael's Episcopal, my aunt's church for over 50 years. I was standing on the steps, the familiar sound of the church bells echoing through the Charleston air, when I began to notice the looks. Subtle shifts in expression from Vivian's old friends, a polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a lingering glance that held more pity than warmth. Then, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman who'd known me since I was a child, approached me, her brow furrowed with concern. She clutched my hand between her soft, wrinkled ones. "Elaine, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the post-service chatter. "Your mother is so worried about you. She told me you're under a great deal of pressure, that perhaps you're not making the clearest decisions right now." The pieces clicked into place instantly. This was their new strategy, a whisper campaign. They were weaponizing the compassion of this tight-knit community, painting a picture of me not as a competent heir, but as an unstable, grief-stricken soldier who needed to be protected from herself. They were laying the groundwork for a guardianship, using the very people who respected my aunt to undermine me. I thanked Mrs. Henderson for her concern, my face a mask of calm, while a cold anger began to smolder inside me. The attack escalated 2 days later, moving from rumors to the printed word. It appeared as a small but venomous article in a local tabloid, tucked between a gossip column and an ad for a psychic. The headline was designed for maximum damage: "Grieving parents rejected by millionaire daughter." The article, quoting a source close to the family, spun a heartbreaking tale. It spoke of Brenda and Richard's ultimate sacrifice in giving me up. It detailed their heartfelt attempts to reconnect and heal the family, only to be met by a daughter who was cold, distant, and hardened by a harsh military life. They weren't just attacking me, they were attacking my service. They were twisting the very qualities the Army had instilled in me: discipline, strength, emotional control, and recasting them as character flaws, as symptoms of a damaged psyche. It was a vicious, calculated strike, aimed directly at my honor. But the cruelest blow came later that week. It was a frantic phone call from David Connolly, the general manager of Hughes Logistics, and a man who had been my aunt's loyal right hand for 30 years. "Captain Winters, Elaine. You need to know," he said, his voice strained with panic. "Your father was just here, at the main office." My blood ran cold. "What did he do, David?" He introduced himself as the father of the new owner and started questioning the staff. He was asking about financials, hinting at a potential sale of the company. "He's spreading poison, Elaine. The team is spooked. They think you're going to sell them out." This was a direct assault on my aunt's legacy. He was deliberately sowing chaos and instability, trying to dismantle from within everything Vivian had spent her life building. He was turning her own loyal employees against me, creating pressure not just on me personally, but on the very institution I was now sworn to protect. The enemy wasn't just at the gates anymore. They had breached the walls. They were attacking my supply lines and my allies. The final definitive declaration of war arrived the next day. It came via certified mail, a crisp, legal-sized envelope that felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The return address was for a law firm I didn't recognize, Hoffman and Associates. My stomach tightened. It was the ultimatum. The letter was cold, formal, and brutal. It officially demanded that I relinquish all control of the estate to my parents, who would act as my conservators. If I refused, it stated, they would be forced to petition the court to have me declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. And then came the line that made the world go silent. The final, unforgivable insult. They would base their case, the letter read, on the clear psychological trauma and emotional instability resulting from your years of active military duty. I read the words again and again. They had taken my service, my pride, my sacrifice, the very core of my identity, and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. They were using the uniform I wore with honor as a shroud to bury me in. That was the tipping point, the final straw, the line in the sand. The quiet, disciplined soldier who absorbed every attack, who stood her ground with silent integrity, was gone. The cold fury that had been smoldering for days finally ignited, not into a raging fire, but into a focused, glacial resolve. My time of passive defense was over. The strategy of holding my position had reached its limit. They had slandered my name, threatened my aunt's legacy, and desecrated my honor as a soldier. They wanted a war. I would give them one. My silence was at an end. It was time to open the armory. Holding the lawyer's letter in my hand, I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. The rage that surged through me was not hot and chaotic. It was cold, dense, and perfectly focused. It was a fuel. In the military, you're trained to channel adrenaline and anger not into panic, but into decisive action. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of my aunt's study, I received my orders. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my car keys, the brass key from Colonel Thompson, and walked out the door. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of a military drum cadence, a march toward a known objective. Every step I took across the gleaming marble floor of the First Citizens Bank lobby echoed in the cavernous space, each footfall a declaration. I knew this was the moment Vivian had prepared me for. This was her final contingency plan being activated. A polite, professional bank manager verified my identity and the power of attorney Colonel Thompson had filed. He then escorted me from the public world of commerce into the hallowed silence of the vault. The air grew cooler, conditioned to a precise, sterile temperature. He used his key, I used mine, and a long, narrow metal box slid out from the wall of numbered doors. He led me to a small private viewing room and left me alone, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft but definitive click. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system. My hands were steady as I lifted the lid of the safe deposit box. As the colonel had hinted, there were no jewels, no bearer bonds, no hidden stacks of cash. There was only a single, thick manila file folder. On the tab, written in my aunt's elegant, decisive script, were 3 words: Winters, contingency. My breath hitched. This was it. I was about to look into the abyss they had dug for themselves. I opened the folder. The first document on top was a comprehensive report compiled by a private investigation firm in Las Vegas, dated nearly 10 years ago. It was a meticulously detailed chronicle of their lives since they had left me on that porch. Page after page laid out a sordid history of grifts and failures. There were copies of casino debt markers bearing my father's signature, totaling a staggering 6-figure sum across the MGM Grand and Caesars Palace. There were police reports detailing my mother's involvement in small-time investment scams in Nevada, preying on retirees. Following that was a long, alphabetized list of creditors, angry former business partners, and civil judgments filed against them. The truth was stark and ugly. They weren't just flawed parents who had made a terrible mistake. They were professional con artists, drifters who lived a parasitic existence, leaving a trail of financial ruin and broken trust in their wake. They didn't abandon me because they couldn't provide for me. They abandoned me because I was an anchor on their transient, predatory lifestyle. I felt a wave of nausea, a profound sickness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the sheer scale of their depravity. Aunt Vivian's quote from Sun Tzu echoed in my mind. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. My aunt had made sure I would know my enemy. But the document that truly stopped my heart was buried near the bottom of the file. It was a printed copy of an email exchange between my mother and a distant cousin named Mark, dated 15 years prior. My hands began to shake as I read Brenda's cheerful, boastful words. She was describing, in nauseating detail, how she had successfully convinced their cousin to approach Vivian for a $50,000 loan to start a promising new catering business. The business, of course, never existed. The emails laid out their plan to split the money once Vivian had wired it. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. My Aunt Vivian, the strongest person I'd ever known, had been systematically defrauded by her own family. They hadn't just used me as a potential access point, they had actively stolen from the woman who was raising me. The pain of my own abandonment paled in comparison to the white-hot rage I felt on behalf of my aunt. To realize she had likely known about this and had shouldered that silent, lonely betrayal for all those years to protect me from the full, monstrous truth, it was unbearable. Before I tell you what I did next, let me ask you something. If you believe that truth is the most powerful weapon of all, please hit that like button. And for those who've ever had to face a painful truth about family, just type honor in the comments below so I know I'm not alone in this fight. I closed the folder. The rage was gone, burned away by the sheer, irrefutable weight of the evidence. All that remained was a chilling, absolute calm. I had it all. The proof of their crimes, the motive for their desperation, the entire sordid history of their lives. In that quiet, sterile room, the power dynamic of my entire life shifted. I was no longer the defendant in their fabricated lawsuit. I was the prosecutor. I took out my phone and, with methodical precision, began photographing every single page of the dossier. Each click of the camera shutter felt like loading a round into a magazine. When I was finished, I composed a new, encrypted email to Colonel Thompson. My thumbs moved with purpose. The subject line was direct. The message was an order. Subject: Intel dossier acquired. Message: requesting immediate counteroffensive plan. I placed the file back in its metal box, slid it shut, and walked out of the viewing room. Back in the main lobby, the normal sounds of the world seemed distant and muffled. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the bank and stepped back out onto the humid streets of Charleston. The defensive game was over. They had declared a war on my honor, armed with lies and deceit. But I was walking out of that bank carrying an arsenal of truth. It was time to attack. It was well past 9 o'clock at night when I returned to Colonel Thompson's office. The daytime hustle of Charleston's legal district had subsided into a quiet, humid hum, leaving the historic buildings to stand in stoic silence. Inside, the atmosphere was one of intense, focused energy. The colonel had dismissed his staff for the evening, ensuring our strategy session would be completely secure. The only light in the expansive, wood-paneled room came from a single, green-shaded banker's lamp on his massive desk. It cast long, dramatic shadows across the walls, illuminating the collection of military honors and photographs, and turning our workspace into an isolated island of light. This was a war room. We didn't approach the evidence like a shaken client and a reassuring lawyer. We analyzed it like two seasoned officers preparing for a complex, high-stakes operation. At my insistence, we laid out each piece of evidence on the polished mahogany surface as if it were a topographical map of the battlefield terrain. All right, Captain, let's assess the situation and define the battle space, the colonel began, his voice a low, focused rumble that absorbed the silence of the room. He pointed a steady finger to the thick dossier from the private investigator. This is our primary intelligence report on enemy forces. It details their history of operations, their established methods, and most importantly, their critical vulnerabilities. We know how they think, how they act when they're cornered. Next, his finger tapped the threatening letter from their lawyer, Gerald Hoffman. The crisp papers seemed to crackle under the focused light. This is the enemy's official declaration of war. It tells us their stated objective, seizing control of the assets, and their intended line of attack, a direct assault on your character and competency. Finally, he gestured to my phone, which held the audio file from the dinner at Hall's Chop House. And this is our boots-on-the-ground reconnaissance, hard confirmation of their immediate financial demands and a clear, undeniable record of their psychological tactics. It's their own voices, their own words. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and analytical in the lamplight. We have informational superiority, Captain. They are operating in the blind, assuming you are weak. They have no idea what we know. Now, we need to define our commander's intent, our primary objective, and our secondary targets. This was the military decision-making process, a structured, 7-step analytical approach to problem-solving that had been drilled into me for 15 years. In the face of chaos, it provided clarity. In the face of emotion, it provided logic. It felt as natural as breathing. Our objective isn't just to win the case, Colonel, I stated, my voice firm and clear, echoing his tone. That's merely a tactical victory, a single battle won. The ultimate objective, the commander's intent, is to achieve total mission success. We need to permanently neutralize their ability to ever pose a threat to me or to Aunt Vivian's legacy again. We need a decisive, unconditional victory, not a negotiated settlement or a temporary ceasefire. A slow, deeply approving nod from the colonel. He recognized the language of absolute commitment. Total victory, he echoed, the words tasting of finality. I agree. And to achieve that, we don't just defend our position. We launch a counteroffensive. He picked up a heavy fountain pen and a fresh legal pad. We will file a countersuit. The moment they file their petition, we hit back. We'll sue them for intentional infliction of emotional distress and for defamation of character. We'll turn their attack back on them with twice the force. He began to sketch out the operational plan, his movements precise and economical, his handwriting a sharp, disciplined script. We will not deploy our heaviest artillery immediately. This is key. We let them walk into the settlement meeting, what they'll see as a simple negotiation, believing they hold all the cards. Their lawyer, Hoffman, will be arrogant, pompous. He'll lead with their absurd claim of your incompetence, citing your military service as a liability. He paused, making a sharp note on the pad, ensuring I was following every step. That's when I'll initiate contact. I'll present the weaker, circumstantial evidence first. The tabloid article, the audio recording from dinner. Hoffman will try to dismiss it, claim it's inadmissible, get indignant. He'll posture for his clients. We let him build up his own self-righteous momentum, let him believe he's winning the argument. The colonel leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, the intensity in his eyes palpable. And then, at the moment of their highest confidence, when they feel victory is within their grasp, we deploy our main weapon. We drop the dossier, the fraud convictions, the gambling debts, the history of scams. We won't be attacking their legal claim anymore. We will be methodically obliterating their moral foundation. We will discredit them so completely as individuals that their entire case collapses under the weight of their own corruption. It's a psychological shock and awe campaign. The plan was brilliant. It was methodical, ruthless, and perfectly aligned with military doctrine. Gain intelligence, identify a critical vulnerability, and apply overwhelming, concentrated force at the decisive point. A surge of cold, clean confidence washed through me. The hurt and anger were gone, burned away and replaced by the pure focus of a mission. As I looked at the names of the victims listed in the investigator's report, an idea began to form. An addition to the plan. A final devastating maneuver that could end the war in a single stroke. I have one more thought, Colonel, I said, pointing to a specific page in the report. The dossier lists the names of their other victims, specifically the cousin, Mark Winters, who my mother used to defraud Aunt Vivian. What if we could get him on our side? Colonel Thompson's eyes lit up with a strategist's gleam. A surprise witness, he murmured, stroking his chin. High risk, high reward. If he refuses, it goes nowhere, and we might tip our hand. But if he agrees to testify, If we can get a sworn affidavit from him confirming the conspiracy to defraud Vivian. He trailed off, a grim, determined smile touching his lips. It would be the kill shot, the final, undeniable proof that their entire narrative of being loving, sacrificial parents is a calculated lie. He straightened up, his decision made. Leave that to me. My firm has resources, and I still have contacts from my time in the JAG Corps. We'll find him. He looked at me, his expression turning serious. You need to prepare yourself, Captain. The coming engagement will be brutal. They will attack you personally. But we are ready. Our plan is sound. He reached for the intercom on his desk, his thumb hovering over the button. It was the moment of decision, the point of no return. He pressed it. Mary, he said, his voice calm and authoritative, echoing in the quiet office. Get me Gerald Hoffman's office on the line. I want to schedule a settlement conference for our mutual clients, as soon as possible. The conference room at Hoffman & Associates was the antithesis of Colonel Thompson's office. It was a cold, sterile environment of glass, chrome, and gray leather. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Charleston Harbor, but the beauty of the scenery felt muted, soulless. It was a space designed for intimidation, a modern battlefield where deals were cut and fortunes were broken. I sat with my back straight, my hands resting calmly on the cool glass tabletop, my face an impassive mask. My mission today was simple: observe and maintain discipline. The colonel was leading this assault. My parents, Richard and Brenda, sat opposite us, flanking their lawyer, Gerald Hoffman. They radiated a smug, confident energy. Brenda offered me a tight, pitying smile, while Richard leaned back in his chair, looking for all the world like a man who had already won. Hoffman, a slick man with a gold watch and an overly friendly demeanor, arranged his papers with a flourish. He began with a long, patronizing speech, his voice smooth and rehearsed. He spoke of the sanctity of the family unit, the natural bonds between parents and children, and the solemn duty of a child to honor their elders. He painted a picture of my parents as loving, concerned figures, forced into this unfortunate legal position by a daughter clearly overwhelmed by grief and the lingering trauma of war. Colonel Thompson listened with the patience of a predator, his hands steepled in front of him, his expression utterly unreadable. He let Hoffman talk until the man had exhausted his entire arsenal of sentimental cliches. When a self-satisfied silence finally fell, the colonel didn't argue. He didn't debate a single point. He simply reached into his briefcase, retrieved the small digital recorder I'd used, and placed it in the center of the glass table. Then he pressed play. The room, which had been filled with Hoffman's pompous monologue, was suddenly consumed by a chilling silence, broken only by the crystal-clear recording of my father's voice. We think it's only fair that you help your parents out a little. $150,000 should do it. The color drained from Gerald Hoffman's face. My mother's smile froze and shattered. My father's jaw went slack. This recording is inadmissible, Hoffman stammered, scrambling for a legal foothold. It was made without my client's consent. It's illegal. Colonel Thompson raised a single, quizzical eyebrow. Is it now? Perhaps you're right, counselor. He reached over and switched off the recorder with a decisive click. Then let's move on to things that are a matter of public record. Things that are, shall we say, perfectly legal. He reached back into his briefcase. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from smug confidence to palpable dread. The first document he produced was a thick, bound report. He slid it across the table with enough force that it spun to a perfect stop directly in front of my father. This, the colonel said, his voice flat and cold, is a certified copy of Mr. Winters's gambling debt profile from Caesar's Palace and the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. The outstanding markers total just over $200,000. He produced a second identical binder and slid it in front of my mother. And this is a compilation of the civil suits filed against Mrs. Winters in the state of Nevada for investment fraud. Small-time scams mostly, targeting retirees. Richard and Brenda stared at the documents as if they were live grenades. Their faces were ashen, a sickly, chalky white. Hoffman lunged forward to protest, but the colonel held up a hand, a gesture of absolute command that stopped him cold. "I'm not finished, Mr. Hoffman," he said, his voice dropping an octave. He then pulled out the third and final file, the Winters Contingency Dossier. It landed on the table with a heavy final thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. "This is the result of a private investigation commissioned by my late client, Ms. Vivian Hughes, several years ago." He opened the file, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I could walk you through the various petty crimes and deceptions detailed within, but for the sake of time, I'd like to draw your attention to a particular exhibit." He pulled out a sheaf of papers and fanned them out on the table like a winning hand. "These are copies of emails between your client, Mrs. Winters, and a Mr. Mark Winters. In them, she quite brazenly conspires with him to defraud Ms. Hughes of $50,000 for a phantom business venture." A strangled gasp escaped my mother's lips. It was a raw, animal sound of pure panic. Richard didn't make a sound. He just seemed to shrink, collapsing in on himself in his expensive leather chair. Gerald Hoffman looked like a man who had just watched his entire career flash before his eyes and end in a fiery wreck. The colonel leaned forward, his voice now like sharpened steel. "Based on this evidence, Mr. Hoffman, we are not only rejecting your client's frivolous and insulting petition, we are hereby informing you of our intent to file a countersuit for defamation, slander, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. "Furthermore, this entire dossier will be hand-delivered to the district attorney's office this afternoon for a review of potential criminal fraud charges." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of total, unconditional defeat. Hoffman, realizing he had been led into a perfectly executed ambush, frantically leaned over to whisper in his client's ears. I could see their panicked, darting eyes, the frantic shaking of their heads. After a tense minute, Hoffman straightened up, his professional facade completely gone, replaced by the pale, sweaty sheen of a man in deep trouble. My clients will be withdrawing their petition," he said, his voice thin and trembling. "We will not be pursuing this matter any further. All claims are hereby rescinded." He and my parents scrambled to their feet, a clumsy, uncoordinated retreat. They moved like defeated soldiers staggering off a battlefield, refusing to meet my gaze, their eyes fixed on the door as if it were a portal to salvation. As the door clicked shut behind them, a profound quiet fell over the room. Colonel Thompson looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, victorious. But I didn't. As the adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, it left behind a vast, hollow emptiness. The battle was over. The enemy had surrendered. I had won. But as I stared out the window at the beautiful, indifferent harbor, I realized the war inside me was just beginning. In the days following the confrontation, I didn't feel the exhilaration of victory that General Patton had promised. There was no elation, no triumphant satisfaction. There was only a profound and bone-deep exhaustion, the kind a soldier feels after a long, brutal campaign. The war was over, but my body and soul were still braced for impact. Vivian's grand Charleston house, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary, suddenly seemed too large, too quiet. The silence echoed with the ghosts of what had been lost. Victory, I was discovering, had a bitter aftertaste. I had successfully defended my aunt's honor and protected her legacy. But to do so, I'd had to detonate a truth so toxic it had permanently irradiated the landscape of my own origins. I had to become the prosecutor of the very people who gave me life. I found myself wandering through the rooms of the house like a sentry on a quiet post. I'd run my hand along the spines of the books in her library, touch the cool marble of the mantelpiece where our pictures once stood, and breathe in the faint, lingering scent of her Earl Grey tea. With every step, I confronted the cost of this war. It had taken more than time and energy. It had taken the last, flickering ember of a foolish, deeply buried hope that somewhere, underneath all the lies and greed, there was a family I could one day reclaim. The battle had extinguished that hope for good. A few days later, they appeared on my doorstep. Unannounced. My security camera alerted my phone. and I watched them on the screen for a moment before answering. They looked different without their lawyer, stripped of their arrogant confidence. They looked smaller. Pathetic. I opened the heavy oak door but stood firmly in the threshold, my body language a clear barrier. "Elaine, please," my mother began, her eyes already welling with tears. They were the same practiced tears from the restaurant, but this time they were laced with genuine desperation. The performance had failed, and now the actor was begging for a reprieve. "We were wrong. We know that now. We were just desperate. Please, just give us another chance." But Aunt Vivian and the army had trained me to see beyond the surface tactics to the underlying strategy. This wasn't remorse. This was the final, desperate gamble of a player who had lost the entire game. These were not the tears of a mother seeking her daughter. They were the tears of a con artist who had just been exposed. "That chance expired 27 years ago on this very porch," I said. My voice wasn't angry or accusatory. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered without heat or malice. My words hung in the humid afternoon air. They looked up, a flicker of hope in their eyes as if my calm tone was an opening for negotiation. I knew I had to be absolutely clear, for their sake, but mostly for mine. "I forgive you," I said, and I saw the relief wash over their faces. I held up a hand before they could speak. "But you need to understand precisely what that means. I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because I deserve peace. I'm forgiving you so that I can move forward with my life without carrying the weight of your poison. I'm letting go of the anger, the resentment, all of it. It's a strategic withdrawal, not for you, but for me." I looked them each in the eye, one after the other, ensuring my words landed with the full force of their meaning. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. There will be no family dinners, there will be no phone calls, there will be no more chances. From this day forward, you no longer exist in my life. This is the end of our story. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't an act of revenge. It was a truth as solid and unchangeable as the ground beneath our feet. I saw the finality of it register in their eyes, the dawning horror that there were no more angles to play, no more emotions to manipulate. I closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing the finality of my words. After they were gone, I walked into Vivian's study and called Colonel Thompson. My hand was perfectly steady. "Colonel," I said, "I need a restraining order." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. "I understand, Captain," was all he said. A few days later, the court order was issued. It legally established what I had already declared emotionally: a permanent, fortified, demilitarized zone around my life. It wasn't an act of hatred. It was an act of self-preservation, the final step in securing my own borders. That evening, as the setting sun cast a golden glow across the garden, I sat in Vivian's favorite armchair with a cup of hot Earl Grey. I picked up a book of meditations from her side table, and it fell open to a page she had bookmarked. Marked in her familiar red ink was the Serenity Prayer. "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." I finally understood. I could not change my parents. I could not change the past. That was the battle I could never win. But I had the courage to change my present and my future. I had the courage to draw a line, and that, I realized, was the wisdom my aunt had been teaching me all along. The war was finally, truly over. And in the quiet aftermath, a new question began to form. What now? What did Vivian truly want me to do with this legacy, this peace I'd fought so hard to win? 1 year later. The seasons in Charleston had turned, bringing with them a gentle healing. The oppressive humidity of summer had given way to the crisp, clear air of autumn. With that change came a new clarity for me as well. After 15 years of dedicated service, I made the difficult but necessary decision to request an honorable discharge from the United States Army. The military had been my crucible and my salvation. It gave me discipline when I had none, comrades when I was alone, and a code of honor to live by. It forged me into the woman I am today. But my service was complete. I had a new mission now, a different kind of front line that required a different kind of commander. I took the helm of Hughes Logistics. The boardroom felt as familiar as a tactical operations center, the challenges of supply chains and market fluctuations just a different kind of battlefield logistics. I didn't just want to run the company, I wanted to lead it according to the principles I held sacred. I implemented leadership strategies learned from the best officers I ever served under. We weren't just focused on profit margins, but on people. We built a culture founded on mutual respect, integrity, and absolute loyalty, not to a boss, but to the shared mission. We created an environment where every employee, from the drivers on the road to the managers in the office, felt like part of a unit, a place where their contributions were valued, a place where they belonged. But Vivian's true legacy wasn't in shipping containers and balance sheets. Her greatest legacy was what she had done for me. It was the unwavering shelter she provided for a broken, abandoned child. It was the strength she instilled, the wisdom she imparted. I knew I had to honor that part of her legacy, the part that had saved my life. To do that, I took a significant portion of the estate's assets and established a nonprofit organization, the Vivian Hughes Young Warriors Foundation. Its mission was simple and deeply personal. The foundation provides college scholarships, mentorship programs, and emergency support for the children of military families facing hardship, specifically for those kids who, for whatever reason, find themselves estranged, unsupported, or cast aside by their own families. I was determined to ensure that no other child would ever have to feel that crushing loneliness I felt on that cold, wet porch. I would be the guardian for them that Vivian had been for me. My world, once so solitary, began to fill with people. Colonel Thompson was no longer just my lawyer. He became a trusted friend, a mentor, an honorary uncle who sat on the foundation's board of directors, his wisdom as invaluable in philanthropy as it was in law. My new family wasn't one defined by blood, but one forged in shared purpose. It was David Connolly and the loyal, hard-working employees at Hughes Logistics. It was the soldiers from my old unit, men and women I still spoke with every week, who shared a bond no civilian could ever fully understand. And now, it was the bright, hopeful faces of the first class of Young Warriors scholars. We were not related by genetics, but we were bound by a shared code of ethics, honor, integrity, and the sacred promise to never, ever leave a comrade behind. The story ends not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but here, in Vivian's garden, the place she loved most. It is the morning of the Foundation's inaugural scholarship ceremony. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Ashley River, casting a brilliant, golden light across the manicured lawns and ancient live oaks. The air is cool and filled with the scent of salt marsh and blooming camellias. The quiet murmur of conversation and hopeful laughter from the young scholars and their mentors fills the space where silence once reigned. As I step up to the podium, I see them, a dozen bright, resilient teenagers who have faced challenges I know all too well. I see the flicker of my own past in their guarded eyes, but I also see an incredible, unyielding strength. I don't tell them my story of abandonment and betrayal. That story belongs to the past. Instead, I tell them about my Aunt Vivian. I tell them about a woman who believed that true strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the courage to act in spite of it. I tell them how she taught me that a legacy isn't the money you leave behind, but the lives you touch and the values you instill. A true legacy, I say, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the quiet garden, is not what you are given. It's what you choose to build with it. Remember that loyalty is earned through action, not demanded by birthright. And family, I pause, looking out at the faces of my unit, my comrades, my scholars. My family. Family is not about the blood you share. It's about the people who stand with you in the foxhole when the world is coming apart. I look at their faces, no longer guarded, but shining with the light of a new dawn. And I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my soul, that I have fulfilled the final mission Vivian Hughes ever gave me. I have honored her legacy, not by guarding her wealth, but by transforming it into what she always knew was the only currency that truly mattered: strength, honor, and hope. My battle is over, but I know many of you are still fighting your own. The story you've just heard is a testament to the fact that you are not defined by those who hurt you, but by the honor with which you rise above it. Thank you for joining me on this mission. If my journey has inspired you, please share this story with one person who needs to hear that they are not alone. It's the greatest way to support the channel. Subscribe for more stories of strength and resilience, and remember, you have the power to create your own dawn.